In seventh grade, which is about 1983 for me, I was hauled into the vice principal's office. Not even the principal's office. It was the vice principal who did the dirty work. And in this case, he was hauling me in because of a terrible situation. He sat me down, sat behind his desk, and held up part of a piece of paper, a sheet-fed printer paper, and said, "Can you explain this?" What he was showing me was an ASCII art nude, or at least part of it, that I had sold to another kid for 50 cents. He looked at me and said, "What do you think you're doing with this on school property?" And in a moment of hubris, which I have rarely showed elsewhere before my early 20s, I looked at him with the most innocent of eyes, and I said, "Why, sir, I just see a bunch of letters and numbers. I'm not sure what you see." My name is Jason Scott. You're listening to the Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It podcast, a podcast about history, technology, stories, and getting myself out of debt. Huge thanks to Daniel Boyd and Jeff Atwood and all the other hundreds of supporters of my Patreon to bring this podcast to life. So I've been running Textfiles.com since 1998, coming up on 20 years, but I've had Textfiles, that is to say actual ASCII files, involved with my whole life, from my early teens to today. And it's interesting to people when they find out that I don't just have old bulletin board system lists or have old writings about how to run certain kinds of computers, but that I have a whole range of racy stories, bomb files, and untoward instructions on how to make everyone's lives around you utterly miserable. The fact is that when I started calling bulletin board systems in my early teens, and I started to take an interest in the Textfile section, I would just download everything they had, and it turned out that a lot of them, I mean a surprising amount, had what would best be called Anarchy Files. Files that would explain to you how to put together these ingredients to make this kind of bomb, or violent fantasy narratives where people would describe how to mess up a McDonald's or destroy a mailbox, or maybe even calls to revolution or calls to change the entire paradigm of government and life and everything else. And here's the thing. At the time, it was just what I ingested. I didn't feel that I was suddenly part of a greater, terrible conspiracy. I certainly didn't feel my ideology being shifted. To me, they were just basically the same as the heavy metal lyrics or the how to make a blue box files. They were just things people wrote when you were young. I collected them up by the hundreds, just like I collected everything else up at that time. And only a few times in my life have they caused me any actual direct problems. As time has gone on, people have asked more and more why I keep them up, and the answer is I keep them up because I've always kept them up, and that I've always kind of saw myself as a librarian of sorts, and librarians don't make it their job to remove as much of their library as time goes on. So they've lived. If you're not aware of this whole weird thing, these bulletin board systems, which in many ways were the province of young suburban males putting computers that were very expensive and often bought by their parents onto phone lines that were also expensive and paid for by their parents, often had a surprising amount of files about how to blow stuff up, and for reasons that I still don't quite understand, would often call themselves Anarchy Files. There's been some effort to figure out why they're called Anarchy Files versus destructive files or bomb files or anything else. There's some thought that it's because of a specific book called The Anarchist's Cookbook, which was written by William Powell, and which the author has done his best to suppress and get taken off the market for decades to no avail. And this, frankly, terribly written book indicates a way to smash the state and get revenge on government oppression by building all manner of explosives. The instructions in the book are not very dependable. They're not very accurate, and they're not very well written. But they are, in their own way, kind of a template for what would come later. I think another major force about this would be the books written by Abby Hoffman, one of the original Chicago 7. There was a tone to his writings, which called also for revolution and pranksterism and living off of the land. It's a very humorous style. It's like your crazy buddy. Try to imagine somebody's driving in a car with you and just says crazy stuff like the beginning of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, right? He just says, I don't know where we're going, but it's gonna be crazy. And I think it's very refreshing for a young person to see this kind of phrasing from an adult. And I think it got internalized, and then as time went on, it became an easy way to add things to your bulletin board to make it seem really underground. And without going too far into the weeds, I'm definitely of the opinion that the urge as a young person to have these files or to put some sort of concoction together that makes a big boom is kind of inherent in the powerlessness of being a youth. Even more so perhaps today, but back then just this idea that you were always told what to do and your schedule was very regimented between your school and your parents, and any sense of having freedom or a sense of agency, however you expressed it positively or negatively, was something that was of huge desire. I tried to explain this all to, believe it or not, a person who had written a book on bomb and anarchy files. Her name is Anne Larrabee, and the name of the book is The Wrong Hands. And it's a study of where bomb files come from and why we have them in society and why the government has both created them and tried to suppress them over literally the centuries. Yeah, that's right. She actually traces it back to the Revolutionary War and the need of the government to codify how to build certain kinds of munitions and explosives and train soldiers, only to be followed by a need to suppress that information as the wars end and the soldiers become civilians and the information falls into the wrong hands. This oscillation, as she explains in her book, happens in between all of the wars. The Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, Korean War. But then with the approach of the information age, these files stop being merely pieces of paper that can be taken away or found or otherwise copied slowly and become digital files where they transfer extremely quickly through instantaneous networks, and the nature of their relationship to regular people completely changes. So back to my life with these things. The Textfiles.com collection, which I would put somewhere in the range of 60 or 65,000 individual text files, has lots of stuff urging people to cause mayhem and mischief and inviting them to do strange and weird things. Of course, there's lots of stuff involving erotica, weird computer requests, and bulletin board system lists, but it in many ways kind of jostles people that on the internet you can still get to these files. And every once in a while, somebody does contact me and ask me, do you really think this is a good idea? Do you think this is the right way to do things? Is this something you should maybe take down? Maybe the world has changed so much that we perhaps shouldn't have these things so easily accessible? And the funny part is, I've only really had any in-my-face problems with these files twice in the last 30 years. I'll describe both of them. The first one was in 9th grade. I had printed out how to make nitroglycerin. Turns out it's relatively easy, except that you might die when you make it, so don't make it. And I'd given it to one or two kids. And these kids, again, didn't have any way of getting the ingredients to make nitroglycerin, but they had the files printed again on little dot matrix feed printer paper, and they took them home. And one of the kids' parents was a cop. So the cop called the FBI. And so I was asked over the PA system to come to the principal's office. And there was the principal and my mom and a guy in a suit. And the simple question was, where did you get this information? As you can imagine, my mother was concerned that I would have nitroglycerin plans. The principal was pretty concerned. And the FBI agent really didn't give much of an impression of anything. He just wanted to know where I'd gotten them. So that answer was actually pretty easy. I had gotten them from a Chicago-based bulletin board system called the South Pole. The South Pole had a whole range of amazing boomity-boom text files. and I had downloaded them all and made them part of my collection. I told the FBI agent this, sorry South Pole, partially because it was written at the bottom of the text file, and I looked at him with the innocent young eyes of a 13-year-old and wondered why it was all a big problem, and what could I do to be better, and was I okay, and I was sorry about everything that had happened, and the FBI agent thanked me for being forthright, urged me to understand that nitroglycerin was not a toy, and I was not suspended or pulled out of school, but I did go home early that day. My mother, of course, completely ill-equipped on how to explain to your son that nitroglycerin is not something to trade around like a baseball card, and that it probably is very, very bad to make and certainly shouldn't be used in any sort of destructive fashion, no matter how much I disliked the school or was having a bad time. So I proceeded to officially not have those text files anymore, and you, of course, can download those exact files to this day. I did learn my lesson, though, and I absolutely did not distribute Anarchy text files via printed sheet paper ever again. Fast forward through all my years of bulletin board systems, and then my years of using the internet, and then my years of starting Textfiles.com and putting all of these files up, and then fast forward even further into the 2000s. Textfiles.com had been up for something like 15 years when I got a call from my ex-wife, and she told me those wonderful words one likes to hear. "The FBI stopped by to talk to you." And I said, "Well, did they leave a card?" And she said, "Oh yes, they certainly left a card. Did you tell them where I am?" "Yeah, I told them you were in New York somewhere and I didn't know how to reach you." And I thanked her. And I waited for that inevitable FBI knock. But it didn't come. Didn't come for months. A year went by. And then one day I was on the phone with a friend in my rented room when there was a knock on the window. And I opened up the curtain and there was a guy. And I looked at the guy, who was this kind of clean-cut dude, and I kind of shook my fingers like, yeah, no, nobody's getting any of my attention today. And then he reached over and put his FBI badge and ID against the glass, and I realized it was check and mate. To my friend on the phone, it must have been the most disturbing thing in the world. What I remember saying to him was, "Hey man, look, we're going to work through this with you. I'm going to be right there for you. I'm going to work with these solutions. And oh, hey man, I got to go. The FBI's here." And I hung up. So at that time I was in my underwear. And in some weird conclusion, I thought, well, the best way to go to the FBI is just in my underwear. So I walked out the front door to two guys in business suits, in my underwear, nothing else. And I said hello. And they asked me if I wanted to get dressed. And I said, nah. So they sat me down on the front stoop of the house that I was renting. And they started to ask me questions. Here's what had gone on. Goddamn Facebook. See, somebody on Facebook was very, very unhappy about the fact that a mosque was being built near the old site of the World Trade Center in New York City. And this person thought that that mosque should in some way be damaged. So his suggestion was to link people on Facebook to the Anarchy section of Textfiles.com and tell everyone to get ideas to go over to the mosque and perhaps in some way damage or destroy it so that this terrible situation wouldn't be. Facebook, in their infinite wisdom, immediately shut down the guy's account and reported him to the FBI and reported Textfiles.com to the FBI. It had gone through the FBI system. Something like 5 or 6 months later, they had gone to my old house in Massachusetts. And then a year and a half later, they finally tracked me down in New York and came to my house and came to me where I greeted them in my skivvies. Throughout the conversation, which was essentially an interrogation, They were trying to determine if I myself harbored anger at the idea of a mosque and anywhere near the old World Trade Center site. And they kept going back to that. Aren't I unhappy? Aren't I angry? Don't I burn with a passion inside? To which I really didn't. I did not have any opinion whatsoever. In fact, I was like, fine, if you want to build something, go for it. I don't know, that's fine. And the FBI agent said something to me which kind of warmed my heart, which was, so according to the First Amendment, we can't make you take any of this down. But I just want you to know, you should probably take it down. I told him I'd take his opinion under advisement. We all shook hands, and I went back into my home. So I'm just saying, if you're going to deal with government agents, could do worse than in your underwear. That's advice right from the heart. Those have really been the only 2 times that I've had any direct contact in the real world about Textfiles.com being in any way a bad thing for merely existing. I've certainly gotten letters now and then, barely a handful of people who are morally offended by either the explosives or the anarchy or the ASCII art pornography. Now, way back then, in 7th grade, I didn't really understand at all what I had there. These were nudes that were created by ham radio operators in the 1960s and the 1970s. I found out that some of them did it by putting an actual Playboy centerfold into a printer and then eyeing character by character which of a family of letters would be the right level of lightness or darkness to handle that particular square. I learned that from an old Bell Systems operator named John Sheets, who was interviewed for the BBS documentary, but unfortunately didn't live long enough to see it finished. He told me about all the contests that they had with ham radio art, or RIDI art as it was called, radio teletype art. Every year they would have text competitions where people could draw things, put them over in RIDI format, which was a 6-bit format, and that meant that it could only do uppercase. And then whoever made the best art, they would pass it around. And it was being sent digitally. So this was over the radio. So everyone would have to be really quiet for a period of time. And then on Sunday nights, he told me, they would all get together and they would blast out different pieces of artwork in radio teletype format and then share them that way. He had thousands of these, and unfortunately he passed on, and I don't know how many of his collection survived. I do know that pretty much all the artwork that he had printed out is on Textfiles.com in the art scene section. It's a pretty wide gap between people who think that something like Textfiles.com is A-OK and people who think it's frankly awful and should be taken down. I don't expect any minds to change from anything I'm saying. I do want to say, however, that it's a wonderful litmus test on the edge to see where people's limits of free speech are, if they believe in it truly and utterly, whether it's something that merely represents the ability to take out a certain book or subscribe to a certain magazine, or if it's truly a case of dedication to something that makes you uncomfortable or makes you question things you're not comfortable questioning, both about yourself and about society at large. It's been a pleasure to host this material, but I also want to point out that I'm not the only person who's done this, and there's many, many other folks who have played their part over the years to host information, both useful and useless, wonderful and weird, pleasurable and painful, in all sorts of manner of media. If you go to textfiles.com and go to the top 100 files, I've peppered in a few classic Anarchy text files there. Of course, you can always go to the Anarchy section itself, where I've done all sorts of separation of bomb files and humor Anarchy files and weird writings and so on. It's all in there. It's nothing different from what I had when I first set up text files as a BBS back in the 1980s. And let me mention one more thing. There is this whole history of text file writing groups that really deserves a lot of attention, a lot of deep research. There were people who would write text files together. Sometimes they were classmates, sometimes they had met over certain computer bulletin boards, and their names are peppered throughout textfiles.com. So these are groups like Neon Knights and Metal Communications and Anarchy Incorporated and the Cult of the Dead Cow and Hogs of Entropy. These are groups that were basically very, very young people writing together in a way that would enable them to put branding and headers and almost like a publishing firm or a writing enclave. And they would produce text files on a regular basis. They would have bulletin board systems that were their main distribution points that they would encourage you to call. In fact, one might even call the text files the loss leader for these bulletin boards. And the files that they wrote, because they were often numbered, meant that the collectability of them was very strong, which meant that they persisted far beyond the bulletin board system era. The Neon Knights and Metal Communications who were affiliated, they'd write all sorts of how to do crazy things text files or weird stories. And then there was Anarchy Incorporated, which came out of California and was a group of technically proficient young people who would also write weird stories of a technical bent and distribute them among a bunch of ASCII Express lines that were located mostly in Silicon Valley. Cult of the Dead Cow was a group of people from Texas who gained members over the course of their decades and shifted away from not just writing text files, but becoming poster children for this new visualization as an unseen army fighting all manner of government and corporate oppression. And then Hogs of Entropy, who were created as a response to the Cult of the Dead Cow, they were written basically to make fun of that entire environment of the 1980s, but in their own way gain many of the tropes and weirdness of those periods in a semi-serious manner. They went on for hundreds of text files. These groups are all part of a lore, kind of an story of creating things that in the web era seem almost as quaint and weird as the zines of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I think that by collecting all of these in one place and making them available, they occasionally inspire people, even in the present era, to take on that interesting process of expressing yourself strangely and calling yourself part of a group and putting things out regularly to gain an audience and to gain recognition of what you're saying being worth reading. This to me is the heart of the text file and the heart of textfiles.com. It's a person who has something to say, who's not quite sure how to get an audience and how to get people's attention. And it's really easy to move into obscenity or anarchy or any sort of puffing up of your own brand. But it's all about, look at me, I've got something to say. I hope you'll listen. A huge thanks to James Bekoyanu, Sam Johnston, Stefan Arentz, Astrid Smith, Kevin Waters, and all the other hundreds of Patreons who have contributed to this podcast. This is Jason Scott. You're listening to Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It. The Patreon is at patreon.com/textfiles. I'm on Twitter as Textfiles. Consider joining the Patreon. Every little bit helps. And thank you so much for listening.